Okay, so thank you very much. My name is Grant Sizemore. I am the Director of Invasive Species Programs for American Bird Conservancy, and I run American Bird Conservancy's Cats Indoors program. And today we are going to talk about Cats Indoors, a conservation movement. So before I really jump into the Cats Indoors program, I want to give a little background on American Bird Conservancy. American Bird Conservancy is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation of native birds and their habitats throughout the Americas. We were founded in 1994, and American Bird Conservancy will celebrate its 25th anniversary later this year. So that's 25 years of a steadfast and science-based commitment to achieving the greatest conservation result for birds. As part of our mission, we seek to reduce human-caused threats to birds, and ABC engages on issues such as window collisions, pesticides, bird-smart wind energy, and others. And within that framework, our framework for reducing threats to birds, falls our Cats Indoors program. So, the talk today, I want to hit three major focal points. This is the science of the ecology of domestic cats in the environment, their role as predators, the epidemiology of domestic cats in the environment, so their role in the spread of diseases, and then talk about what some of the policy solutions are for cats, birds, and people. So we'll start with the ecology of domestic cats. So domestic cats were domesticated about 10,000 years ago in the Near East. Their nearest relative today is the Near Eastern wild cat. That's Felis sylvestris libica. Cats were probably passively domesticated gradually over time as cats and people became more familiar with one another in an agricultural context. And you can see here some of the relationships between cats, domestic cats, and other wild cat species, which are presented graphically from this study that was published in 2007. And the domestic cat on the right is in the sort of orangish region. So that's where the Near East is considered. Since domestication, and due to the close affiliation cats have with people, cats have been spread across the globe. This study, published in 2011, reviewed cat introductions and their subsequent impacts on islands. And you can see that cats have made it to virtually all corners of the world. Now, moving forward, as we consider the ecology of cats, I think it's worth reviewing first the definition of invasive species. An invasive species is one whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human health. And a few widely recognized invasive species include Burmese python, running amok in South Florida, feral hogs, and European starlings. Now, like these species, cats, at least when they roam the environment, are an invasive species. And I hope you'll see through some of the science that's presented as we continue how cats fall into the invasive species context. Okay, so the introduction of domestic cats to new environments across the globe has led to wildlife population declines and in some cases species extinctions. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the Stevens Island wren, which is presented here on the bottom right. In 1894, a lighthouse keeper, and he was actually an amateur ornithologist, relocated to Stevens Island in New Zealand. And with him, he brought his cat, Tibbles. Within a very short amount of time, Tibbles brought home a bird completely unknown to science. So this lighthouse keeper, or rather his cat, had discovered a new species, one that had evolved and existed for centuries without cats in the environment. Now, unfortunately for the Stevens Island wren, cat predation caused the entire species to be extinct within just a couple years of discovery. So I think this example really highlights how cats can have such a dramatic and indeed quick impact on local environments. The tale of Tibbles really is one example of many. And across the globe, as we see presented here graphically, domestic cats have contributed to the extinction of at least 63 species in the wild. Now this includes 40 bird species, 21 mammals, and 2 reptiles. At least 430 threatened or endangered bird, mammal, or reptile species are currently impacted by cats. The gray bars in this graph are the threatened and endangered species, and the red bars represent the species now extinct in the wild. As a result of these impacts, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature lists cats to be among the world's most harmful invasive species, and you can see it's included in the Global Invasive Species database. So around the world, cat predation can result in staggering numbers of killed wildlife. In Australia, cats kill hundreds of millions of birds and reptiles every year. In Canada, outdoor cats kill approximately 200 million birds every year. And in the United States, cats kill an astonishing 2.4 billion birds every single year. In fact, cats are the top source of direct human-caused mortality to birds, both in the United States and Canada. Now, these predations are concerning because cats, like I said, are an introduced species and not a normal part of a healthy, functioning ecosystem. And in North America, 1/3 of all bird species are in need of urgent conservation action. Now, predation on wildlife isn't caused by just 1 or 2 cats, but it's actually the cumulative impact of over 100 million outdoor cats in the United States. And each cat contributes some portion of the total wildlife deaths. Even well-fed cats will hunt and kill wildlife. And for most of us cat owners, we see this as cats interact with their toys. Play behavior, although fun inside the home with feather toys or laser pointers, can become deadly when those toys are replaced by wild animals. Now, a study that was published just a couple of years ago by Lloyd and colleagues reviewed wildlife rehabilitation intakes and the role that cats have in contributing to those intakes. They found that domestic animals were the second highest cause of intakes after the category called orphaned, and were responsible for 14% of all wildlife admissions. Cats, specifically, were responsible for over 8,000 intakes and 8% of all admissions. Of those cat-related intakes, 68% ultimately died. 78% of those cat-attacked birds died. And cats were implicated in the admission of 290 different species. So we're seeing a large impact contributed to by many, many different cats across a large area that impacts a wide variety of wildlife. Now, roaming outdoor cats may also indirectly affect wildlife. Predation by cats, it can change the relative distribution of different species and ecosystems, and you can see this in the graph on the left from Hawkins et al., published in 2004. They showed that the presence of feral cats, indeed in this case fed feral cats, in California resulted in lower abundance of native birds and mammals and a higher abundance of non-native species, particularly house mice. Now, the study on the right by Crooks and Soule observed a similar negative relationship between cat abundance and bird species diversity. The degree of predation pressure was enough to drive some species to local extinction. But interestingly, when coyotes were present, that modified the impact that cats had and reduced the impacts cats had on local wildlife. Now, finally, an indirect impact that cats may have on the environment was identified by researchers in the United Kingdom in research published in 2013. And they found that the mere presence of a cat in the environment was sufficient to lead to reduced nest success. Even when a cat didn't hunt, and in this case, they used a model of a cat, not a living cat. But even when a cat didn't hunt, its presence modified bird behavior resulting in reduced feeding of young and nest survival. So that kind of covers the role of cats as predators in the environment. And now I want to move on to how cats interact with the environment as a potential spread of disease. So cats can carry and transmit a large number of diseases. And I'm not going to go over all of these. This is a list published in 2015 by Lepchik and his colleagues. You can see that some of these are specific to felines, things like feline panleukopenia, but others are not so specific and can be carried and transmitted then to other taxa and to people as well. So I want to talk a little bit more about two of these diseases, rabies and toxoplasmosis. So rabies is predominantly an eastern United States disease, but it's particularly concerning because it's nearly 100% fatal once symptoms arise. Now, dogs were traditionally associated with rabies, but as a result of successful dog control programs, dog rabies has been virtually eliminated in the United States. And now, cats are actually the top carrier of rabies among domestic animals. Furthermore, cats are disproportionately more likely to expose people to this disease than wildlife because people are far more likely to interact with a cat than wildlife. More people are likely to try and pet an unknown cat than they are to try and pet an unknown skunk or raccoon, for example. In the U.S., approximately 16% of all post-exposure prophylaxis, that's the vaccine you get once you've been exposed or potentially exposed to rabies. 16% of all those vaccines are administered because of an exposure to cats. And these exposure events can be incredibly expensive for municipalities. Now, in this graph of confirmed rabid cat reports taken from data reported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, you can see that, for the most part, cats constitute a huge percentage of the total number of rabid domestic animals, far outnumbering dogs. So the percentage of cats as the confirmed rabid domestic animal is in orange, and you can see that is a very high percentage in most states. Okay, we're going to move on from rabies now and talk about toxoplasmosis. It's a fascinating disease. So toxoplasmosis is caused by infection with the parasite Toxoplasma gondii. And this parasite relies on felines to complete its life cycle. It can only sexually reproduce in the gut of a feline. Once it does so, the parasite's eggs, which are called oocysts, are excreted into the environment through feces, where they can then infect any warm-blooded species that might accidentally ingest or inhale one of these oocysts. Now, whereas felines are what's called a definitive host because they're necessary for the parasite's life cycle, other birds and mammals are potential intermediate hosts. Now, when one of these birds or mammals become infected, the parasite clones itself in the host's body, creating cysts throughout the tissues. And then, should that intermediate host ultimately be consumed by another intermediate host or a definitive host, the infection can be transmitted to the new host. The trick for this parasite, and one of the reasons I think it's so fascinating, is it needs to get from its definitive host to another definitive host to complete its life cycle. And it does this through a type of what I call zombie parasitism. This was identified in a study by Berdoy and published in 2000. And they conducted experiments with rats and found that although rats typically avoid areas with cats, because cats are a predator, infected rats were actually attracted to cat scent. The parasite modified the host's instinctive predator avoidance behavior in a way that increased the likelihood of the host being eaten, ultimately completing the life cycle for the parasite. So you can see in this graph from their study that infected rats were more likely to go into areas marked with cat urine, whereas uninfected rats were more likely to be found in areas with a control odor. In this case, it's rabbits. A single cat can excrete up to hundreds of millions of infectious oocysts, and each oocyst may persist and remain infectious for months, if not years, in terrestrial, freshwater, or marine environments. So I mentioned that all birds or mammals may become intermediate hosts. This, of course, includes people. So people can become infected by directly ingesting oocysts from contaminated air, soil, or water, or eating another animal that consumed oocysts. Infection can have a variety of impacts in people, as little as flu-like symptoms to miscarriage, fetal abnormalities, blindness, mental retardation, memory loss, and death. Infection has also been associated with neuropsychiatric diseases such as schizophrenia and obsessive compulsive disorder. But I think it's worth noting that at this point, it's unclear whether what the cause and effect is associated with those neurological disorders and Toxoplasma gondii. In the U.S., it's estimated that over 1 million people are infected newly every year, and over 10% of the U.S. population shows signs of infection. So the parasite has the potential to cause epidemics, which you can see in this research presented on the top left. And it's prevalent and dangerous enough to be the leading cause of death among foodborne illnesses in the United States, the second leading cause of death among foodborne illnesses in the United States. Surprisingly, though, despite this fact, just very recently, the United States Department of Agriculture announced that it was going to terminate its world-class research program on Toxoplasma gondii. Now, research has indicated that because of the large number of cats in the environment and the significant impacts to people as a result of infection, that all sandboxes, and this is the picture on the bottom right, should be considered contaminated unless they've been covered at all times. So just a word of warning, if you have kids that like to play in a sandbox, make sure that sand has no Toxoplasma gondii in it. Okay, that covers Toxoplasma gondii. Now I want to move on to some of the policy solutions that exist for the issue of cats roaming the environment. So let's start with owned cats. So for pet cats, really, I think the solution is pretty clear. It's time to treat cats like we treat dogs, by keeping them safely contained indoors, on a leash, or in a catio. No longer should it be acceptable to simply open the door to let a cat wander across roads or in wildlife areas or onto your neighbor's property. Not only is keeping cats contained good practice that protects wildlife, it also protects from injuries and infectious diseases to both cats and people. A study published just earlier this year found that outdoor cats are nearly 3 times more likely to be infected with parasites than indoor-only cats. So indoor cats live longer, healthier lives, and this lifestyle is actually recommended by the AVMA, the American Veterinary Medical Association, which, quote, encourages veterinarians to educate clients and the public about the risks associated with allowing cats free roam access to the outdoors. Now, in addition to being safely contained, owned cats should also be sterilized and microchipped to prevent accidental breeding, curb behavioral issues, and increase the chance of a cat's return to its owner should it accidentally become lost. And there's been research on the return rate to owners versus in cats that are microchipped versus cats that are not. And a 2009 study found that microchipping cats increased owner recovery from 2% to 39%. So that's a 20-fold increase. And that brings us then to unowned cats. So to successfully reduce the populations of unowned cats, we must install management programs to address one or more of the vital rates of cats, such that births plus immigration is less than deaths plus emigration. Now, not only is this critical to implement programs that are science-based in their effectiveness, but we should also consider the unintended impacts of management activities. And for cats, the big question is whether or not these animals remain on the landscape. And programs that keep cats roaming outdoors will continue to contribute to wildlife and human health issues that we've already mentioned above. So I want to touch on TNR real briefly. So TNR stands for trap, neuter, release, or trap, neuter, return, or trap, neuter, reabandon, or some other variants are called return to field or spay, neuter, return. But in short, TNR programs are counterproductive. Despite the promotion by certain groups as the only humane and effective way to control stray and feral cats, TNR neither successfully reduces cat populations on any meaningful scale, nor reduces impacts to wildlife or public health. On the contrary, TNR actually facilitates these ongoing issues. And on this slide, you can see there are a handful of studies that have reviewed TNR and found it to be an inadequate solution for cat population reduction. Now, when we're implementing any sort of cat population control, we also need to consider what are the impacts for infectious disease transmission. Now, for rabies, to be effectively immunized against rabies, a cat must be given an initial vaccine, then given a follow-up booster after 1 year, and then regularly immunized every 1 or 3 years, depending on the vaccine manufacturer's recommendations. Because of the rabies risks, the National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians opposes trap, neuter, release, TNR, and recommends that stray animals be removed from the environment. Now, part of the problem with TNR programs is that although they may provide an initial vaccination, and sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, they do not provide the follow-up immunizations that are necessary to protect the cat and public health. And we also have to consider how we might control Toxoplasma gondii. So a fairly high prevalence of Toxoplasma exists in cats, as you can see on this in this table on the left. And it means that locations with roaming cats are really likely to be contaminated with oocysts at some point. That's the excreted infectious egg of Toxoplasma gondii. And remember, these oocysts remain infectious for really quite a long time. So research on environmental contamination from a variety of ecosystems emphasizes this point. Oocysts are implicated in the infection of wildlife such as white-tailed deer in Ohio, that's the study on the bottom left, and sea otters off the coast of California. In Hawaii, where domestic cats are actually the only felines present, infections in native wildlife, like endangered Hawaiian monk seals and endangered Hawaiian geese, are definitively caused by domestic cat excreted oocysts. And a recent study by Aguirre et al. Made the point that cat management policies play an important role in managing risk from Toxoplasma. They said, quote, policies that intentionally maintain unowned and feral domestic cats on the landscape facilitate and may increase the risk of disease transmission. So what do we do? What are the solutions? Well, American Bird Conservancy is dedicated to goals that reduce impacts on wildlife as well as public health and achieve meaningful and long-term welfare for cats. So our goals are containment or direct control of cats, as we've discussed, and the proactive removal of stray and feral animals from the environment. Now, in order to achieve this, we are implementing strategies that raise the level of care and concern for cats. So no longer should cats be considered a disposable pet that, you know, if they don't show up, you just say, oh, well, I'll get another cat. They need to be considered at the same level of care and concern as we do dogs. We're also putting forth common sense and science-based ordinances that will protect cats, wildlife, and people. And finally, we believe strongly that on-the-ground management, of course, will be necessary to achieve these ends. So what are some of these policy solutions that we're talking about a little more in detail? Despite the huge magnitude of harm to wildlife, the considerable risks to public health, and really a tradition of unrestricted roaming cats, there are a few relatively simple policy solutions that could be implemented either in part or in their entirety that will reduce the negative impacts of roaming cats on the environment. The first of these is the adoption of modern state and local laws that recognize the value of cats as pets and the importance of caring for them just as we do for dogs. Now, American Bird Conservancy has developed a model ordinance, which you can see on the right, part of it anyway, that can be used by communities to update their animal control laws. Now, critical to these laws is the inclusion of 3 elements, and we've already discussed these, but just to reemphasize: sterilization, permanent identification, and containment. It's no longer acceptable to permit dogs to roam the landscape, and I think the very same should be true for cats. Second, feral cats are clearly an invasive species because their introduction can and does cause harm to wildlife and human health, and these harms also have economic consequences as well. So to increase public awareness and facilitate actions to manage feral cats on public lands, more state and federal agencies need to formally recognize feral cats as an invasive species. Each state has an invasive species council, and each of these councils should similarly recognize feral cats as invasive. Models for invasive species listings already exist, as you can see here. One of these, being the Hawaii Invasive Species Council, has a webpage on feral cats, which could be very useful. Finally, the adequate and just as important, the appropriate distribution of resources is essential to permit local education, management, and enforcement. Open admission shelters need public and government support to meet their animal control needs, and state funding opportunities should focus on science-based strategies. And when I say science-based strategies, I want to point out that there are certain states, like Maryland right now, the Department of Agriculture has funneled $240,000 to TNR programs just in fiscal year 2017. And this amounted to 30% of their total spay and neuter grants. This money could go a long way toward effective animal control if it were put somewhere more meaningful, like keeping cats contained. And what is ABC doing about bringing about these solutions? So ABC is working to achieve these policy solutions through education, outreach, science, and management. We've developed and aired several public service announcements. We premiered a short film called Surviving the Wild, Cats and Birds. That film told the stories of 3 wildlife rehabilitation facilities and their struggles, really to undo the harm to individual animals caused by outdoor cats. We've also used the Endangered Species Act to successfully remove feral cats from Jones Beach State Park in New York, where feral cats were a threat to federally threatened piping plovers. And we've also launched the Happy Cats, Healthy Birds campaign, which worked with social media cat influencers to model responsible cat ownership solutions and to highlight the benefits to cats from safe containment. And we're making progress, but there's a lot more work that's needed. And I want to invite all of you to join that movement. If you own a cat, you can employ responsible behaviors that protect cats, wildlife, and public health. And all of us can stay up to date with emerging news and opportunities through the Cats Indoors newsletter, for example, and engage legislators at the city, county, or state levels to support consistent pet ownership expectations and effective animal control policies. Now, American Bird Conservancy has resources available on our website, such as relevant science and brochures, and all of these can be helpful in joining the movement and taking on some of these issues. And I invite you to check out our website or to contact me for more information about what you can do in your area. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and conclude my presentation. And I want to thank all of you for your attention. Thank you very much.